In college, I took a class on proportion and figure drawing. It was the one where I was taught nothing of value, as mentioned in the previous video, but more than not being taught anything useful about drawing proportions, nothing was taught about the meaning behind certain proportions. What happens when you take a normal humanoid and distort it? Elongate the limbs, bulk up the muscles, widen the chest, squash the whole body? Different things elicit different responses. It's why so many cute things are small and chubby while a seemingly endless number of monsters can be described by the words tall and thin. As it is the spooky month, I figured I'd discuss the aspects of design that make something creepy or monstrous, and why. I'm only going to be focusing on the tall and skinny of monsters, but I fully intend to do more videos along these lines because, as I mentioned, this sort of thing was not taught in any class I took, and while I'm sure most people have a basic understanding of the concept, I would like to elaborate on why these concepts exist and how they can be effectively used in art and design. I will preface this, as I will do with most, if not all of these types of videos. These are not hard facts. These are my own interpretations and understandings of a subject. So if you believe I got something wrong or have your own opinions on anything, please leave a comment. I'd love to hear your thoughts on things. But enough introduction. Let's get into the proportions of a monster. So, I should start off by saying that obviously a monster does not need to be tall and skinny to be viable, nor do I think that in any way. I have no doubt a monster can be highly effective in any form should it be rendered well. But I think it's pretty obvious that one form rises above all others in popularity. Actors like Javier Botet, whose name I probably butchered, and Doug Jones have spent a good part of their careers portraying such monsters, and may have themselves influenced their popularity. But I think there is more to it than that. I believe that the towering, emaciated monster has deep roots in history, culture, and even evolution, which has allowed it to come to the forefront of horror. In fact, there are 3 reasons which I think are primarily responsible for the commonality of tall, skinny monsters. These reasons being, first, for lack of a better term, symbolism, form, and movement. Let us start with symbolism. Why is them being thin such a common trait? You'd think a giant bulky monster more in line with trolls or bears would be more common. A frail creature shouldn't have the same presence as one that's all muscle. But I believe that to think that would be ignoring the symbolism of a thin being, especially one as unnaturally thin as we often see. I think it would not be inaccurate to describe these monsters as emaciated. And emaciation brings to mind certain things. Famine, disease, and death being on the top of the list. These are the images we have interpreted from emaciation for centuries. It's where the Grim Reaper came from. It's why skeletons are the only ones having a good time in medieval art. Some of them aren't even full skeletons, but are actually emaciated, sickly, possibly undead corpses. In addition, while not quite as symbolic in the literary sense, height has the same deep-seated roots in human history. Long before emaciated figures were used as imagery and allegorical characters for death, they were still seen as a negative for their implied disease, starvation, and death. Height has the same origins. From an evolutionary sense, creatures far greater than yourself could likely be viewed as a threat. Bears are the first thing to come to mind, for they are the largest terrestrial predator that we know of. A bear on its hind legs could be as tall as 7 or 8 feet. This does not simply apply to predators, though. No doubt throughout history, and even today, taller humans are generally viewed with more respect than shorter ones. They are seen as more powerful, imposing, literally above you. Height as a statement of power is deeply rooted in the human mentality. So is it any wonder monsters would be tall? In regards to form, a strong silhouette is one of the most important things in designing an iconic character, and this is no different when it comes to monsters. It's what makes xenomorphs such a lasting monster. They are instantly recognizable by their distinctive shape, even without the benefit of lighting. Though not all characters are so lucky. I can't even give examples for this because all of these characters have such terrible silhouettes they had to cheat in order to be identifiable. Why is this? It's because of their proportions. When a character is super bulky, the limbs and body all blend together. Going back to the example of bears, with just a silhouette, there are some angles where they are instantly recognizable. But there are many more where you could just as easily be looking at a pile of rocks. As I said, this is because their bodies are covered with thick muscle and fat and fur, and their limbs are relatively short and wide. All this comes together in a very poor silhouette because there's too much mass and overlap and not enough negative space. Alternatively, if we look at something else, something with more negative space, less bulk, something more spindly. Spiders. I bet if you were out in the woods and saw a strangely shaped mass in the distance, you'd think, is that rocks? A tree stump or something? Could be a bear. But could also not be. I have no idea what that is. But I bet you can identify a spider across the room with pinpoint accuracy. Why is this? What makes spiders so recognizable? My guess is it's the bulbous body and 8 long, spindly legs that splay out in all directions. The 8 legs leave a distinctive shape and arch up in such a way that they are easily identifiable from all directions. There is so much negative space from their wire-thin legs that their thinness ensures that they will rarely overlap. And not only are they thin, they are long. Most spiders have very long legs when compared to the body. This means that even if the legs happen to end up being obscured or blended with the abdomen, they are usually long enough that they stick out past it in one direction or another. This principle carries over to humanoid monsters. Take, for example, arms. If a human were to cross their arms over their body, you can guess at what they're doing, but it's not entirely clear. This is because the arms get blended with the torso. The elbow is right next to the body, and the forearm gets lost in the mass of the torso. Whereas if you extended those arms significantly, the elbow would stick out enough to create a gap, while the forearm and hand extend past the body. The blending of arm and body can even happen in a normal standing position, but if the arms were longer, they dangle further down, separating them from the torso and making the hands more prominent. It's obviously the same with legs. You can have them in more crouched, beastly poses without the risk of the legs and body becoming all one mass. And of course, narrowing the limbs and body only creates more negative space to better identify the monster. This entire concept of silhouette is incredibly important in most things, but horror especially, since more horror media takes place at night or in the dark. A strong silhouette allows the audience to glean a lot of information about the creature, even when it's mostly obscured. This also allows you to show your monster without fully revealing it. Originally, this video was just supposed to be about the physical design of monsters, but I feel that movement is an important component of what makes this type of monster so effective. Movement can be as effective a means of portraying a monster as imagery alone. You could create the most nightmarish beast imaginable, but if it doesn't move in a way that fits it, it will simply fall flat. But what movement best suits such a monster? There is a certain type of movement that seems to always induce the desired reaction of fear and unease. The jittery, jerky movement of something not quite alive. The stilted and jarring bursts that give puppets and stop motion such an eerie feel. The movements that are so clearly orchestrated by means beyond their own musculature. It strikes us so greatly because we know that this type of movement is not natural to humans or animals or anything living. Though that's not quite right. There is a creature that moves almost exactly in this way. One that I have previously mentioned. Returning to spiders, An interesting fact about them is that they have hydraulic muscles in their legs, meaning they actually use hydraulic pressure from their open circulatory system to extend their limbs rather than extensor muscles, which they don't have. This is the reason why they move in such a horrible, jittery, stop-motion-y way. This movement is what is so often replicated by Javier Botet and Doug Jones to add extra creepiness to the monsters they play. Though in some cases, like the Crooked Man, I'd say they actually changed the frame rate or something to get that effect. I don't know, I'm not a film student. Granted, this spider correlation is not necessarily the reason why this type of movement is creepy, though from an evolutionary standpoint it might be. But I think it's closer to the fact that spiders move in a way that is due to an entirely different muscular system to us. So for a human or humanoid to move in such a way just adds to the sense of wrongness. We know how vertebrates move, and they are not supposed to move like that. This is part of the appeal of Doug Jones and Javier Botet. Both the way they move and contort their bodies seems to conflict with what a human or humanoid creature should be capable of. Now, at the beginning, I said this was a video on the art and design aspect of monsters. So, if you're like me and your preferred medium, or the only one really available to you, is drawing, you might be wondering, how do you portray this type of movement in a still image? Well, while you might not be able to draw the movement itself, you can imply it. Lean the body in unusual ways, hyperextend the limbs as if it's supporting itself on its bones rather than its muscles. Twist the joints in unusual directions, within the limit of anatomy, of course. A pose is movement condensed into a single image, as a pose can portray as much character as the design itself. Or something like that, I don't know. While all these factors alone can make for something quite disturbing, bringing them together amplifies them all. Height can seem natural with the appropriate muscle and bulk to support it, but when reduced to a gaunt, wiry frame, it seems incapable of supporting its own weight. And while an emaciated figure can be grotesque on its own, elongating the proportions leads to the emaciation looking more extreme. Jerky, contorted movement draws your attention to the impossible proportions. The length of the limbs creates longer strides, greater, more unnatural movements, turning them into an enormous marionette in the vague shape of a human, as if the entity wishes to mimic us but doesn't know how. By contorting a human figure in this way, you are turning it into everything that it shouldn't be. Tall and gaunt beyond what should be physically possible, and moving in ways human physiology was never meant to. It turns a familiar form into something truly alien, almost dragging them into the uncanny valley. There's just enough familiarity that it's recognizable, but enough of the unknown and unnatural to repulse. Not quite a protoplasmic mass of ever-shifting sludgy eyes and pseudopods, but far enough from what we know to be natural to give us the feeling of revulsion and wrongness. If you wish to design your own monster, take these aspects into account. Not necessarily to copy them, but to understand their purpose. As I said in the beginning, I believe that there are no concrete rules to creating a monster. But as I have demonstrated here, there are certain things that will amplify your design more than others. Some only work in the right conditions. For example, if you want to go in the opposite direction and make a bulky monster, it's better to have them more lit or have features that stand out since they don't have as strong of a silhouette. Other than that, I hope this was insightful or at the very least interesting to watch. I feel like it got a bit rambly and nonsensical in a few places, but honestly I have no idea. That's how I feel like I talk normally. As usual, if you have any thoughts or critiques or insight on whether or not this was even comprehensible, I'd love to see it in the comments. Videos like this analyzing design concepts is what I'm most interested in exploring with this channel. So if you enjoyed this, there's likely to be many more along the same lines in the future. In fact, I've got another analysis coming out for the spooky month next week. Not on a design concept, but more on a certain genre of horror. I hope to see you there. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed, please press all the buttons and follow me in all the places. I hope to see you next time, but until then, good night.